Okay, we're going to move on to chapter 5 now in our textbook, which covers urban hierarchies. Now, hierarchy is the way that you classify very large settlements and everything in between the large settlements to the smaller settlements, and what that means for things like population and complexity. And the first model we're going to look at is a model actually developed by a South African Professor R. Davies in the 60s. And he used this model to classify some of South Africa's urban settlements into different categories. And if you just look at this pyramid, you'll notice that at the top, or the smallest little triangle right at the top, we have what we call a primate metropolitan area. So this, nowadays we would call this a megalopolis, which is one of those massive combined cities where the cities have just sprawled into each other and connected. And you look all the way down at the bottom, and at the very bottom of the pyramid is our local service center. Now, that is our smallest urban settlement, basically a small town. And everything in between. So the terminology he used was local service center at the bottom, a minor town, a country town, a major town, a metropolitan area, major metropolitan area, and then a primate metropolitan area. And at the top, the primate metropolitan area, we would call a highest order central place. And then at the bottom of the scale, where we've got the smallest local service center, the smallest urban settlement, we call the lowest order central place. And you could classify everything in between using that. Is it a higher order urban settlement or a lower order urban settlement? Now, if you imagine moving up to the top of the pyramid at one of the highest order central places, you can imagine that there would be a lot more functions there, there'd be a lot more people there, and there'd be a lot more services available in that primate metropolitan area. And there would be less of those things in the local service center. So you'd have far fewer people living in a small town, you would have much fewer functions, and it would not be as complex. There'd be less economic activity going on in the small town. Now you might wonder, well, why is the pyramid shaped like this? Why is the local service center the largest, the large base? And that demonstrates the number of these urban settlements. Now, in South Africa, there are thousands and thousands of small towns with maybe a petrol station and maybe a couple of houses in them. There are many of those in South Africa. There are also many small country towns and little dorpies all over the show. Plenty of them, high number of those. And that is because they often offer services that many people need. Like they go get your petrol there, go get your food, and maybe some clothes. That's the goods you need to get. Whereas the primate metropolitan area, say for example Gauteng, or the Witwatersrand, as a conurbation almost, or the conurbation of the Witwatersrand. There's only one of those in South Africa. So the small tip of the pyramid demonstrates that there are really few of those big metropolitan areas. They are very small. There are very low numbers of those. Then that's what these two arrows show on the left-hand side. So as we go up the pyramid towards the top, we find that there are larger and larger populations. More and more people live in that settlement, and less people would then live in the local service center. And then the yellow arrow shows us that there are many local service centers, tiny little petrol stations and a couple of houses, very many towns and small urban centers in South Africa. But there are very few major metropolitan areas, much fewer number of those in South Africa. Okay, so let's move on now that we've established this. This model wasn't based in the 1960s, but it is still very relevant for us today to classify our cities into a hierarchy. So now we're going to move into another model which was developed in the 1930s by Walter Christaller. And it gives us a very nice way of understanding how cities relate to each other, urban centers relate to each other in terms of their size and the location and how they're spaced apart. And ideas of this central place theory are that basically you want things that are very convenient, you want things that are cheap. Businesses try to maximize their profits by being as close to people as possible. And finally, consumers themselves do not want to travel very far. So think to yourself, how far are you willing to travel for, say, your milk, right? I am probably not willing to travel more than a couple of kilometers. Like it must take me a few minutes to get to my milk. Obviously, some people live further from a shop, but yeah, I don't want to spend. I'm not going to travel far to buy milk, and the reason for that is because I need milk all the time. It's something I'll buy very regularly, and it's very low value. It's fairly cheap, so I'm not going to travel to another province to buy milk. The same applies for, say, basic goods like, say, chocolate. It's a low value good. I'm not going to travel very far to get it. However, I might be willing to travel a bit further if, say, I had to buy an appliance, or maybe a nice appliance, or maybe something that was a bit rare. I would probably be willing to travel a bit because I didn't buy that thing very often. It might be a higher value, so I would be willing to go and travel a bit further. Then when we get to luxury goods, and I've got two things here. I've got a Porsche and some high-end audio equipment as an example. These are extremely high value. The average person doesn't buy these. You will not buy that all the time. It's an extremely rare purchase, and it's high value. So that means I will be willing to travel very, very far to buy one of these luxury goods, much further than I would for my packet of milk or my chocolate. And those are the basic principles of central place theory before we move on to the actual model itself. Okay, we need to divide our thinking up into these two ways of phrasing things. The one is lower order and the other is higher order. And the easy way to think of these is in terms of our low order goods, the things we would buy. So examples of low order services or functions are things like things that you need all the time: milk, bread, furniture, petrol, ATMs, butcheries, spaza shops. Those are things that you're always visiting them. We need them every day, basically, because the things we buy from those places are not expensive, or we're not going to want to travel very far. So I'm not going to want to travel to another province to go to the butchery or buy milk because it has low value to me. So these are things like milk, bread. The place you buy your bread is probably from some neighborhood convenience store, which we would call a low order center, or maybe if you apply this to an urban settlement, it would be a lower order urban settlement. These things like, say, milk and bread or groceries are things that I need regularly, so I am not willing to go very far for these. I will not travel far to buy my milk and bread. Therefore, the business owners would have to locate those businesses much closer to where I live. So think to yourself where your nearest butchery or ATM is. They're very close to you, which means in South Africa there must be thousands and thousands and thousands of spaza shops and little petrol stations and shops selling milk and bread and your groceries and little furniture shops. There are many, many of those, many lower order goods. Now let's compare this with higher order functions, higher order services. And these, if we look at the examples, are very expensive items which we do not need very often, like expensive sports cars, jewelry, things like university, or maybe special medical treatment that you can't find in other places. And these are things that are high value, they are expensive, and I do not use them very often. I will use them very infrequently. So because people use these very infrequently, they are willing to travel very far for such goods and services. So if I wanted to buy an imported sports car, you can see in the background Lamborghini, people would travel to different countries to buy sports cars, or I would travel to Cape Town. I'd travel very far to a different province probably to buy one. Think of maybe going to university. People often they move just to go to a different university, or if they need medical treatment, they will travel extremely far to access that service. So because people are willing to travel very far, these companies do not have to be located particularly close to their consumers. So for instance, a university, well, there's not a university on every street corner, because it is a high order good and people are willing to travel very far. So you can locate your business based on the understanding of central place theory. So let's now move on to looking at some examples of this and the actual model itself. Now, if we look at some other findings of central place theory, we've discussed the first one. So larger populations can support more functions. Okay, that's a simple fact of life. If you think of a massive city, well, that means there are a lot of people in the city working and earning money and requiring certain services. So those people would need to buy things. They would need to buy lower order goods. They would also need to buy higher order goods. There's just more people and more demand. So the larger your population is, well, the more functions you can have. Whereas if you have a really small population in some tiny village somewhere, those people cannot support expensive shops and high order goods. You would have to travel to get those. The second one is that there are more lower order goods available just in general. So things like bread and milk, well, there are millions of loaves of bread sold every day. Whereas an expensive imported car, there might only be one sold, every few weeks or maybe every couple of months. You would not sell many of them. Then, as we discussed already, there are many more small urban settlements, much more small towns and smaller cities than there are big ones. And this is the same in the whole world. There are many large cities, but there are thousands and thousands more smaller urban areas or urban centers. Then the final finding or idea of central place theory is that the spacing of these things. So a low order urban center would be much closer together than a higher order center, which is the same analogy as my shop. So if I went to a spa, the spas can actually be much closer together, or the ATMs can be scattered quite closely together, rather than, say, a university. Like, universities are very far apart. In many cases, they are hundreds of kilometers apart, whereas my shopping center or convenience store or a petrol station is located just a few kilometers apart, very close to each other. So let's move on to the model. Okay, so the central place theory takes this model. It's a very nice model. It's very simple. The idea is that in the middle you have a central place, and the central place could apply to an urban center, like a town or a city, or a small service center, or you could also apply it to a business like a convenience store or an ATM or a petrol station. So central places, that's why it's a good model. It lets us explore and apply it to different things. You'll see then there's a range of goods. The range of goods is the distance that people are willing to travel to access that service or function. For instance, to your milk. How far are you willing to go to buy milk or bread, or go to the ATM and get petrol? Not very far. Whereas you, in a different situation when you're buying luxury vehicles, you probably have a much larger range of goods. We'll look at some examples now. Then the number of people that are required to support that function is called the threshold population. So to support your local Checkers or your local petrol station, there's quite a small threshold population. You don't need that many people to support it, because those people who are buying that are accessing that service all the time. Like, you will go to the shop many times over within a week. You'll go there maybe at least once. And the distance between if we make a circle around my central place, the outside sphere is called the sphere inference, and this is basically the range determined by it's the kind of outer limit of where my threshold population is contained, and the distance they are willing to travel for goods. So let's now look at two examples of this, because the things that will change are the type of central place, and depending on the central place, your range of goods will be larger or smaller, and your threshold population and the sphere inference will also change. So let's look at an example of a low order system, so like a spa or a small urban center. And if I look at my spa, the top diagram, I will see that on the right, my sphere of influence is small. I don't need that many. I can contain a smaller threshold population. My range of goods is small as well, because people are not willing to travel that far for that service. Therefore, there are many shops. Like at the bottom, the number of such services, there are many spas and small Checkers and ATMs around the place. Another example, if we apply this to a city or a small town also has a much smaller range. So a small town, people are not willing to travel very far to their town to buy petrol, buy bread, because those are low order goods and services, so people will not want to travel very far. Like, people will not come from all over the world just to go to your little town. People would have to live in the area to actually access those services. So when you're looking at small towns or small businesses that sell low order goods, the sphere of influence is usually small, The threshold population is small, the range of goods is small, but there are many, many, many of those centers located around the place. And they can be located fairly close together. Think to yourself of how many ATMs there are. They're quite close together. Or say a McDonald's restaurant or KFC. There's many, many. Even on your way to school, you'd pass multiple of those. Now let's look at an example of a higher order service or a higher order urban settlement. So I've drawn a city in the middle. There's also a Lamborghini logo to represent maybe a higher order business, higher order function. And if you were accessing a city, think of Johannesburg. People travel all over the country to come to Johannesburg for things like work, for education, for healthcare, for business. So Johannesburg has a very, very large sphere of influence. Some people travel all over the world to come to the city. The threshold population of Johannesburg is massive. So we have millions of people, in depending on where you count in Johannesburg, I think millions of people. The range of goods is also large. So people are willing to travel from different provinces to come here to access the services. So people would drive or travel very far to come to the doctor here or come to the universities over here. And if you look at the number of these settlements or businesses, there are few of these. So in South Africa, large cities, you could count them on your two hands. There's not that many large cities. And the same could be said for, say, a higher order good. Like an example is my expensive car. There is not an expensive car dealership on every street corner in South Africa, even though in some parts of cities, like say Sandton, it does look that way. So if you are buying in the market for an expensive car, you might even travel to a different country to access that. The expensive car, the service that an expensive car dealership has a massive sphere of influence. People would come from all over to your business, which means that they would be located very far apart and there would be very few. So there are very few of these dealerships because they are supported by they're supported by a very large number of people in this large threshold population. Okay. And that completes our central place theory and urban hierarchy section. You need to know these two models, the one of the urban hierarchy and then also the central place. And think to yourself when you're doing the central place models, think to yourself of how often you access these every day or maybe every few days. How often do you buy a luxury appliance? Even if you buy it fairly regularly, you don't do it every day, whereas a lot of people buy things like bread and milk every day, or they go to the petrol station or ATM every day. And if you go there every day, you're not willing to travel very far. So that is why businesses use this understanding of central place theory to locate their dealerships or their fast food outlets very carefully, so that they are taking advantage of the small range of goods, that the small distance people are willing to travel, which means you just have more restaurants. But if you are, say, a Porsche dealership or an expensive jewelry like Swarovski dealer, then you do not have to have shops all over the place because people will travel very far to actually access your services.